Morning. So, Sky Song, Chapter 8, back to Flint again. Where on earth have you been? Tompkins shouted. Flint winced. But before he could reply, a small, tubby girl dropped down from a swing and charged through the ropes towards him. Her hair was short and wild about her face, as if she'd cut it herself in a hurry, without a mirror or even scissors. My brother! You give me happy! She cried, flinging her arms around Flint's waist. Flint reddened, and for a moment he forgot all about the trouble he was in. Instead, he felt Esca's eyes on him, and he wondered whether he could see that Blue was different from everyone else in the tribe, that her eyes were smaller and sloping, like almonds, and that her words came out all jumbled, even though she was 8, and she should have known better. But when he glanced at Esca, he saw that she wasn't frowning. She wasn't raising her eyebrows in disgust either, like some people did when they spoke to Blue. She was just watching carefully, as he'd noticed she often did, without saying anything at all. I miss you, brother, Blue said. Flint ruffled her hair. I'm here now. Blue tickled Pebble beneath his chin, then she turned to Esca and shot out her little hand. Who you? I'm Blue! Esca blinked. Her words were cut short by a thump. Tompkins had leapt down from his swing and was striding across the room. He threw himself up before them, a necklace of razor-sharp bear claws splayed around his neck, a large knife hanging from his belt, and Esca found the words drying up in her mouth. Tompkins jabbed a finger in Esca's direction. Who is she? She's not a spy, Tompkins, Flint said quickly. There were murmurs from the swings around them. At least, I'm almost certain that she's not. I met her at Winterfang. Tompkins' eyes blazed. Winterfang? Why were you at the Ice Queen's palace? I was trying to rescue Ma. Of all the reckless, stupid, irresponsible things you've done, Tompkins spat, this is the worst. Blue clung onto Flint's arms. Be nice, Tompkins. Be nice to brother. But Tompkins didn't even look at his sister. Instead, he narrowed his eyes at Flint. You're still inventing things, aren't you? Even though I told you to stop. No, definitely not. Flint grimaced, knowing how hollow his words had sounded. He'd never been a good liar. You made a bunch of stupid objects that you thought could help rescue Ma, Tompkins hissed, but they didn't work. They never work, Flint. When will you learn that magic can't be trusted? Blue put her hands over her ears. You're an inventor, not a warrior, like the rest of the fur tribe, or at least you're meant to be. Tompkins shot a glance at Pebble, who was peeping out of Flint's hood. And it's high time you dumped that fox pup back into the wild where it belongs. When we found its mother dead last spring, you were told to drown the pup because it wouldn't survive without her. He shook Flint by the shoulders, and Pebble leapt down from Flint's hood and cowered behind Esca. You're too old for pets now, and you're too old for me to be rushing around deep roots trying to find you. Flint shrunk inside his furs. The whole tribe was listening to what a terrible disappointment he was. Even Esca now knew it, and the shame burned his cheeks. Blue let out a whimper, and Flint stroked her hair. You're upsetting Blue, he said quietly. I'm upsetting Blue, Tompkins spat. You ran away. For a moment his eyes softened. Imagine if you hadn't come back. Flint reached out to touch the necklace his little sister wore, the one he had made by attaching a rabbit's paw to a loop of willow twine. It was a good-luck talisman, or so the carvings he'd found in the woods claimed, and Flint hoped that it would keep his sister safe. I'd always come back, Blue, he whispered. Always. Blue wriggled free and poked Tompkins in the stomach. Not nice words. Friends. Tompkins sighed. We spent months and months building this hideaway, Flint. We can't afford to have the Ice Queen and her spies following your tracks and finding us. Flint shook his head. It snowed last night. Our tracks are covered. Until deep roots, at least. I wouldn't put us in danger. There were more mumblings from the fur tribes. Then someone called out, What about the girl? Why's she here? We've no room for outsiders. Esca took a small step behind Flint. This is Esca, Flint said to his brother. I don't really know who she is, but she was the Ice Queen's prisoner, and I think she knows things that could help us. There was a long and painful silence. Then Blue turned to Esca, shot out her hand once again, and said, I'm Blue. Eska took her hand and tried to smile, but one by one the fur tribe stood up on their swings, and that's when the shouting began. "Look at her eyes!" cried one girl. "She's a Tusk spy." "She's not welcome here," a boy shrieked. "She's the Ice Queen's pet. Tell her to leave. We can fight our rebellion without an outsider." Tomkin put up his hand and the voices were quelled. "That's enough. I need to speak with my brother alone." Flint turned to Eska, then pointed to an empty hammock beside them. "Sit there," he said, "and don't attempt any conversations." Eska seemed about to say something, but Tomkin was already marching off between the swings, and Flint had to hurry to keep up. The tribe were muttering now, casting fierce looks towards the visitor sitting by the door, but Flint ignored them. He ignored Tomkin, whispering to Blade, Tomkin's second in command, as they passed, too, but as he stooped to enter a small tent made of caribou skins at the far end of the room, he glanced back towards Eska. Blue was chattering away to her, and Pebble was hopping between them. He paused for a second. There was something about this girl, something he couldn't put his finger on, and she wasn't strong or impressive, and yet he was starting to believe that there was something special about her voice, something secret but yet important. He ducked inside the tent to find his brother sitting on a stool. Barely taking a breath, Tomkin launched into his lecture. "The fur tribe fight with weapons, not far-fetched ideas, and you need to remember that." Flint wanted to tell Tomkin about how well his gyrfalcon whistle had worked, and about how he had so nearly managed to reach their mark, but Tomkin raised a hand before those sentences could unravel, and, with a heavy heart, Flint filled his brother in on all that he had seen and heard in Winterfang Palace, and about the things Eska had told him of the Ice Queen's plans. "What if Eska could help us?" Flint said. Tomkin snorted. "That runt you dragged in? She'd be of no help to anyone. And a voice, Flint, even from you. That type of thinking is ridiculous. How could a voice beat the Ice Queen? You've been spun a line by a girl." "At least speak to Eska," Flint muttered. He got up to go. "Just listen to what she has to say, then you can decide." Tomkin sighed. "It's no point, Flint." "But there might be." With that, he hurried from the tent to go and find Eska, but as he wove through the ropes, he noticed how quiet the room was. The rest of the fur tribe were crouched on their swings, watching him with slitted eyes, and when Flint reached the door, he saw that only Blue and Pebble were on the hammock. Eska was nowhere to be seen. Flint made a dash towards the door, but a bulky boy clad in lynx furs blocked his way. "Whose side are you on?" Flint, Blade asked. And Flint realised then what had happened, why Tomkin had whispered to Blade on his way to the tent. "You made her leave, didn't you?" he said quietly. "On Tomkin's orders?" Blade raised his chin. "She didn't belong here. Tomkin's right. We can't trust outsiders at a time like this." Flint chewed his lip. Back at the food store, he had planned to abandon Eska if Tomkin saw no use for her, but then he'd seen her with the eagle, so stubborn and fierce, and something inside him had shifted. There was more to Eska than first met the eye. Yes, she had messed up his chances of freeing his ma, but did she really deserve to be cast out? And what if her voice really was the key to defending the Ice Queen? Flint glanced up at the fur tribe and tried to read their faces, but one by one they turned away so that he was left looking at a sea of backs. And then Tomkin emerged from the tent and made his way through the swings towards his brother. "It's time to grow up, Flint. We need warriors, not dreamers, to bring the rest of our tribe home." Blue picked up Pebble and stroked his head. "We're your friend, Flint. I like friend." Flint felt something tug inside him, but he shook it away, remembering instead the humiliation of being shouted at by Tomkin in front of everyone, and he turned his heart in the direction of his tribe. "She wasn't my friend," he muttered. "She was a stupid Tusk spy." Chapter 9. Eska. Eska ran blindly into the twilight, her head full of bears and wolves and cursed anthems. She hadn't wanted to leave the labyrinth, even when Flint disappeared into the tent and she was left alone with the fur tribe and their mutterings. "She's cursed by the Ice Queen! She's rotten to the core!" But Eska was no match for Blade, and when he had seized her by the arm and marched her towards the ladder, she'd had no choice but to follow. Now she kept running, Back in Winterfang, she had always dreamed of escaping and finding the tribes, but the Fur people hadn't been what she was expecting, and she felt more alone than ever now. When Blade had grabbed her, she had wanted to call out for Flint, whom she had started to think of as a friend, but she hadn't dared, because she could see the Fur tribe were turning against him, and Flint didn't deserve that. Eska stumbled over a log and crashed down into the snow. She lay there for several seconds, her eyes shining with unshed tears. An owl hooted, the darkness drew closer, and Eska forced herself to her feet. She needed to find some kind of shelter before the light vanished completely. Food would have to wait until the morning. The shadow of a lynx flitted between the trees, and every time a branch creaked or a twig snapped, Eska flinched. But she kept going until eventually she came to a few slats of wood arranged like a wigwam around a tree trunk. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hide her until dawn, and so, gathering up a handful of sticks and moss for a fire, Eska crawled inside. She reached into her pocket and drew out the 2 splints of metal Inch had stuffed into her palm as Blade pushed her down the ladder. She hadn't looked to see what they were at the time, though she'd had her suspicions, but as she turned them over in her hand, now she had felt a lump in her throat. Fire starters. There had been goodness among the Fur tribe, but their fear of outsiders was so deep-rooted it meant it wasn't as easy to spot as she had hoped. She struck the metal splints against each other again and again, just as Flint had done back in the food store, but nothing happened, and before long Eska's fingers felt like rods of ice. Please work, she whimpered. Please, please work. And perhaps somewhere the sky gods were listening, because the flames caught then, and, lying on her side in that abandoned shack, Eska watched them flicker until she fell asleep. She woke to the sound of a sleigh skimming over the snow, stamping out the embers of the fire. Eska waited. The light coming through the slats showed it was dawn already, but something wasn't right. Eska listened for the Ice Queen's anthem, for the voices floating out over the kingdom, but there was nothing, which could only mean one thing. The Ice Queen wasn't in her palace. She was on the move. The sound of the sleigh drew closer, and Eska hugged her knees to her chest. It sounded different to the sled that had whisked her away from Winterfang. It was louder against the snow, heavier, and, instead of the patter of husky paws rushing through the trees, Eska could hear the pounding of hooves. Her blood froze. Musk oxen. And only one person rode a sleigh drawn by musk oxen. The Ice Queen. Eska's skin chilled. The Fur tribe would have brushed away her footprints from the labyrinth the night before, but once a safe distance away from the hideout they would have left them, which meant the Ice Queen could track her. Eska chewed her lip. She couldn't stay. The Ice Queen had hexed these musk oxen, that's really difficult to say, so that they had the strength to run for hours on end. They would find her soon. She had to run fast, as far as she could. She lifted back a slat of wood and darted out of the shack into the dazzling sunlight, half running, half stumbling as she pushed through the trees. Her legs were unsteady beneath her, and after a few seconds, a stitch burned in her side. But she forced herself on, one boot in front of the other. She wasn't going back to Winterfang. Not now, not ever, never again. Eska scrambled over fallen trees and skidded on patches of ice, but fear made her blunder on. Then she threw a glance over her shoulder. The Ice Queen's silver sleigh was there, 50 metres behind, carving a channel through the trees. The Queen's eyes met Eska's, and she smiled through thin blue lips, her teardrop gown billowing behind her. 2 tusk warriors clad in breastplates of ice armour and holding whips and spears stood on the sleigh either side of her, and in front 4 enormous musk oxen with matted black coats and swooping horns churned up the snow. "Stop! In the name of the Ice Queen!" the guards roared. Eska dragged her legs on, her heart smashing against her ribcage. She needed the forest to close in like it had around the labyrinth. Then the Ice Queen's sleigh wouldn't be able to force its way through. But the trees here were growing sparser and smaller, and from behind Eska, a whip lashed and the musk oxen ran faster. Then, to Eska's horror, the trees stopped. Just like that, and she burst out into the open. In front of her now were the foothills of mountains, rolling valleys that folded in rivers of melting ice, and little copses of trees, before eventually climbing up to form the Nevercliffs. The morning sun glittered over the hills, and, with a sweeping sense of dread, Eska tried to keep running, but even the slightest incline bit back at her. She didn't have the stamina for the wild, and she knew it. The sleigh raced closer, and Esker whirled round to see the Ice Queen just meters away, standing in front of her cushioned seat, her staff held high in her hands. Esker grimaced and turned to carry on, but the Queen's words wrapped round her like a snare. You ran away, Esker, ungrateful child, and everything I did to keep you safe at Winterfang. Keep me safe, panted Esker as she ploughed up the hill. You held me under a curse. The moment the words left her mouth, Esker realised her mistake. Fear had made her careless. It had caught her off guard. So you can speak, you little wretch. And then the Ice Queen laughed, a bitter laugh that made Esker's skin crawl. She ran on, hardly daring to look behind her, then something hard and cold slammed into her back, and she was flung face first to the ground. Spitting snow and gasping for breath, she looked up. A circle of musk oxen closed in. Their heads hung low, their black ice horns glinting in the sunlight. The Ice Queen held up her staff, and the musk oxen stayed where they were, thrashing their horns from side to side. Then she stepped off her sleigh, leaving the tusk guard standing either side of it. I've come to take you home, she cooed, and the musk oxen parted as she stepped into their circle. She stooped and slid 5 long white fingers round Esker's neck. Esker's pulse drummed at the sight of the red ring on the Ice Queen's thumb. She'd heard Slither say it was filled with frozen blood. Then, quite unexpectedly, there was a scream from one of the guards. The eagle had come out of nowhere, a golden bullet racing through the sky and ripping the guards' spears from their hands. The men grappled in the snow for their weapons, but before they could snatch them up, the eagle turned and plummeted again, raking its talons across the guards' faces. The men fell to the ground, clutching their bloodied skin, while the eagle beat its mighty wings up into the sky once more. Ignoring the guards' cries, the Queen grabbed Esker by the scruff of her neck and dragged her towards the sleigh. She stamped her staff onto the snow, and the musk oxen obeyed, gathering in line before the vehicle. But the eagle was careering down again, its body tucked in like a barrel. Esker closed her eyes as the bird plunged towards her. She felt sure that it would never stop, but at that very last moment it spread out its wings, and in one sweeping arc it dashed the staff from the Queen's ice hand, splitting it in two with its talons. The musk oxen jerked at the ropes that bound them to the sleigh, suddenly waking from the curse that the staff had held over them, and when their ropes snapped, the Ice Queen's grip on Esker loosened, just long enough for her to dart free. She scrambled backwards, hardly noticing that something had slipped from her pocket into the snow, then flung herself into a run. Behind her, the Ice Queen screamed as the musk oxen, no longer under her command, charged off into the forest. Esker ran at the hill, her ears ringing with the eagle's high-pitched cries, and only at the top did she allow herself to glance back. The eagle was nowhere to be seen now, but the Ice Queen was bent over the snow, and with a shrill laugh she picked something up and glared at Esker. I will steal your voice by force, she shrieked. When Slither sees what I have here in my hand, there will be no stopping his contraption. Esker's insides turned as she dug her own hand into her pocket. The key to the music box was no longer there. And, while she couldn't possibly know what Slither had created or how the Ice Queen planned to use the key, Esker realised the threat of it all because the Queen was stalking off towards the forest, back to Winterfang, with her guards trailing blindly behind her. She could have battled on against the eagle if the bird had returned, but she hadn't, and that fact lay like a cold, dark stone inside Esker. She watched the Ice Queen disappear into the trees, then turned back to the foothills. They rose and fell before her like waves, and Esker wondered how anyone could remember their way through when every hill looked just like the last. She sighed, then her eyes fixed on a lone tree a little further down the hill, and there was the eagle, perched on a branch like a sentinel. Esker approached slowly and stopped just a few meters away from the bird, and as she watched the majestic creature, something like a memory, only looser and less defined, stirred inside her. It was a feeling that although she had no obvious place amongst Erkenwald's people, she might just have a place amongst its animals. The feeling lingered for a second longer and then vanished, and Esker carried on looking at the eagle. It was the same one she had freed from the snare before, Deep Roots. She could see the wound to its left talon still red and raw from the trap, but that hadn't stopped it attacking just moments ago. And Flint's words about it struggling to survive with an injured talon seemed almost ridiculous now. But even if Eske hadn't seen that talon, she would have known the eagle by its eyes, yellow orbs, fierce like the sun. The eagle blinked, then it launched itself off its branch and sailed across the hills until it was nothing more than a speck in the sky, leaving Eske alone once again. And that's where we're going to leave that. So I will see you again. Have fun, whatever you're doing today. Bye-bye.